Simon Bailey, welcome to Leading in the Dark.
Thanks, Nick.
So you are the CEO of T-Kartor. Tell me what that company is and your path to becoming the CEO.
Sure. So T-Kartor is mainly in the DoD IC realm, the Department of Defense Intelligence Community area, supporting geospatial solutions and services for primarily for the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency here in St. Louis, and then also supporting both the federal agencies across the IC. And then also we do quite a bit of what we call the civic transportation area with wayfinding and cartographic solutions that we actually do in the kind of state, federal, local work that is supported as well by us.
That sounds awfully high tech. What is geospatial? What does that mean?
So geospatial, to break it down simply, taking a number of disciplines for remote sensing, which is reviewing satellite imagery or aerial photography and collecting of features on the Earth. Instead of having just imagery, you have vector data. It does involve map making or cartography information, but for the most part, with being such a digital world now, we find ourselves more producing databases and data sets that can have analysis performed on them. Obviously, the amount of data that we're actually producing now and bringing together is also utilized a lot for AI purposes to help automate workflows and actually make decision making across both the federal sector and state local work, and then also for companies that want to dig in and try to understand better of different areas they're working on and need a geospatial context to make it a spatial understanding. Really think location-based information.
Sounds like some of this could be fairly sensitive type work, but can you give an example of a practical use case of what this data is for?
Sure. So one of the areas that we actually perform work at that I can talk about is in the area of safety of navigation for both the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and with our parent company in Sweden, who actually performs work for the Norwegian military. We produce aeronautical maps for aviators that will be used in the government, and then also that work entails making sure that all what we call vertical obstructions, man-made object, basically obstacles that a plane or needs to know about before they approach or cover an area that they could actually cause an obstruction to them. The safety of all that is really a big piece of what we do around the globe, actually.
I'm somewhat familiar with this industry because my father worked his entire career for the NGA, retired probably over 20 years ago at this point. And so I remember going to the open house as a kid when they were still hand tracing maps. I remember playing with the tools where they would hand trace these maps. And one of the applications I heard about back then, which always fascinated me, was they were essentially mapping variations in gravity across the globe, right? So if you have a big mountain range or a big depression, that might have very minor changes in the gravity, but that's necessary to calculate sending a ballistic missile from here to the other side of the planet, that you need that data.
No, you're right. That information does matter. Luckily now, a lot of those math models are built into a lot of the software we use, so we don't necessarily have to be a mathematician and start doing all those calculations by hand like you used to do back in the day. As you can imagine, software's come a long way. So when you're dealing with different datums and projections and your mapping needs, or when you're bringing data sets in from different datums and projections, a lot of that information can be translated and managed by the software to help you really save time and not worry and sweat some of those details.
So you did not start out at this company as the CEO, correct?
Correct. I did not. That is a interesting pathway of how I got to where I'm at. I guess you want me to dive in on that, I guess, since
Yeah,
you brought it up.
sure. Tell me about it.
Yeah, I basically started my career out as surveying. My father was a general contractor. I grew up in the state of Florida, specifically in the Tampa Bay area. And one of my first jobs out of high school was working at a construction company. And I realized at that point when I was working that I saw the surveyors and I realized that sounds like something cool I want to do. And so I went and got a job as a grunt surveying. So rodman, chainman, they called them. And your job was to go out and either cut brush line for line of sight for the survey instrument or, pound hubs into the ground for building layouts on a construction site and so forth. And That was really my first job into this kind of mapping, surveying realm. And I did that for a number of years. And while I was doing that, actually, I realized quickly that when I was actually packing the truck with supplies in the morning, I would actually get to talk quite a bit to the guy inside that was using AutoCAD at the time to take all the information we'd collected. And of course, this is going back 30 years ago. So AutoCAD, of course, back then was not like it is now. And so we would just bullshit in the mornings, and I realized, wow, this computer aided mapping, I really think this is up my alley. I'm going to do this. And back then, it was funny now thinking about it, but back then you actually had to get a drafting like certificate before you could even take an AutoCAD class back then. So I had to sit there and learn how to do drafting manually, which totally never used it again in my life after that because it was really just to get me into the computer world. But that was a prerequisite back then. Once I got that certification, I ended up applying for a job at another company that was looking for some third shift personnel to do, and I didn't realize at the time, but it was to do NGA work. It was actually back in the day, and I don't know if you ever remember seeing this back when you got to do some of those open house visits with your father at NGA. But back then they had what they called dig boards, and these were giant boards, like a light table that faced sideways. And you would take a map and you would pin the map to the light table or this dig board. You would have to register the coordinates to the map in the computer with a puck that was plugged in. And you would trace features with a puck on a dig board that would get entered into this computer system. And you were basically recreating the map digitally by tracing over it with this hand little puck on a dig board. And you'd be standing there 8 hours a day tracing maps to make them digital. Little did I know that work was actually being done for NGA and actually was specifically being done because I'm not sure, I don't remember the year because I didn't live in St. Louis, of course, but the big flood that would happen back in, what was it, the 80s or 90s?
Early 90s.
Yeah, and I think NGA's facility, it got flooded, right? There was a lot of places got flooded here in St. Louis, and they had a big loss of their map sets and their actual source data in their basement area. And so they had a big initiative to actually turn all that information digital. And so that was my first forte into this world that I had no idea, but would just suck me in and keep me going. It was kind of like the mob. Once you start doing this type of work, it seems like that's what you're set for.
I do remember that. So if I recall the year correctly, I think it was 93 because that was the year that my family moved to St. Louis. My dad got transferred. They shut down the Louisville office and got transferred out here to St. Louis. So I remember seeing the flood and hearing about that facility getting a lot of water damage.
Yeah. So anyway, that was what led me into this type of work. And then through some different career changes, I shouldn't say career changes, but basically job changes, I found myself eventually getting an option of going to work for Boeing. And I relocated to Washington, D.C. area, spent about 8 years working for them. And then it was right around the time of sequestration, I guess is what you call it in the government side, where a lot of jobs were moving out of D.C. because of cost of labor out in the DC market. And I got the opportunity to move to St. Louis. And now I've been out here for about 10, 11 years now.
And specifically at your current company, it looks like you started out as a program manager, but then we moved from that to the CEO role. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah. So I'll back up a little bit. When I got so during that time of sequestration, when I was working for Boeing, there was a big competition going on, the current contract or recompete. And Boeing did not win the contract. And there were two companies that won, but I was heavily involved in the proposal, so I knew who all the team players were involved. And so at that point, Boeing started to downsize and move people around because of the fact that this contract we weren't going to have long term. And I had known, even though to just make a statement about Boeing, I knew that even if Boeing had one, we were changing the labor to be more St. Louis driven anyway, from probably where we were 50-50 between DC and St. Louis then. It was going to go more probably 80% St. Louis, 20% DC, just to be more competitive with labor rates. So I kind of had in my mind that I might end up in St. Louis, even if I'd stayed with Boeing. Due to the fact they didn't win this contract, I ended up basically on the market. And got picked up, I decided I wanted to go back to a small business because I'd started off at a small business in Florida. And I got the opportunity to come out and work for a company called Continental Mapping, and who was headquartered in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin. Now, what's interesting about this, as I mentioned, is because this is a crazy time. There was Harris Corporation was actually had a St. Louis office, and one of their big things, they had won the contract, and they really wanted to have all their suppliers in the same building. So we were several companies, and I won't go and name them all, but several of the companies and subcontractors were all located in this same footprint because they wanted to have a geospatial innovation kind of center. And so we're all working there, and it was a great concept, but quickly turned into a crazy scene of imagine 5, 6 companies that are competimates working in a building together. You're training people. They're going to the restroom when they're coming out with a job offer from another company. It was like a knife fight. It was crazy times. And so there was constant poaching going on, and it just did not work out as everybody thought it would. It just got into a bloodbath, quite honestly, between all these companies and personnel. Eventually, I got poached, and I ended up at T-Kartor. I got brought in as a program manager there, and that led me into the role I'm in now because the opportunity came up where the T-Kartor is a subsidiary to a Swedish entity, and the CEO had an opportunity to go somewhere else, the current CEO at that time, and they asked me to step in and lead interim status at first, and then after some time, they asked me to stay on, and I've been there since.
Simon, I think you might be being a little humble because just on surface, jumping from program manager to CEO sounds like a big leap. So you must have been doing something well. Were you leading teams? You had to be doing something to demonstrate being able to take on the CEO position.
Well, yeah. So I was basically brought on, even as program manager, to almost be the right hand to the CEO at the time. While my title might have been program manager, I was basically running the entire federal side of the business for him so he could concentrate on some other commercial products and really keeping things operationally going for him. In effect, I was probably acting more like a COO at the time for the entity with the title of program manager. Call that the small business effect, right? You wear many hats. Do titles really matter? It was an interesting opportunity that I'm so happy I took on. And in fact, it was funny when I was thinking about that earlier, actually, I realized that it is almost an essence of my whole career. I feel like I've constantly been put into positions where I never really sought out necessarily leadership CEO. I felt like almost was asked, selected, needed in a way to take more of a leadership role in general throughout my career. It's just always been one of those things. I don't know if it's like that old scene in the movie where everybody's standing on a line and they say, hey, if you're going to volunteer, step forward, and everybody else steps back. And I'm the only guy that didn't move. I don't know if that's what happened, but it seems to, obviously I've done well, but it's funny. I never sought out to have a corner office, lead a company. It's just one of those things that the clouds parted and the opportunity presented itself and I jumped.
I hear what you're saying, but I'm curious what drew you to take on that CEO role and the title, because I think most people, if they were presented with the opportunity, would probably say no. Everybody thinks that they want to be the CEO or have that fancy title, but probably will shy away from it if presented with that reality. So what drew you to take that on?
I've always been in a situation in my life, and when I think about it, where I don't really ever say no. For me, there is a need to fill. If there's something, if I'm one of those people that I may not jump and volunteer right away, but if nobody else is going to do it, I'm going to take it on because somebody needs to. It's just one of those kind of things. I actually always think about some of the old sayings where the best leaders are the ones that didn't ask for it. I feel like that really resonates with me just because I have the ability, I show up, I solve problems, I take responsibility, and I know I can handle it. It's need to be done. Somebody had to do it, and I was the best fit. I knew that at the time, and there's what was going to happen if I didn't take it on? What was the transition period going to be? Were people's other employees' lives going to be impacted because of delays of them trying to find somebody else if I'd said no? I didn't want that to happen. It was too important. There were too many things going on, not just for the company, but the work we were doing for the government. There's a mission to get done. And how do you execute that without skipping a beat? I just didn't want to me, that's the importance of getting the job done and thinking about the soldier on the ground we're helping, or if it's for humanitarian efforts, what we're actually doing the work, because it's so important. Along with the fact that my colleagues and my coworkers, I having a transition period that I'm bringing somebody else in, and even if they found somebody else, are that going to be the right person? We don't know them. It just seemed the best way to move forward as quickly as possible.
Listening to you describe that, it strikes me as a servant style leadership approach. Is that how you would describe yourself?
Maybe. I don't know. I've always considered myself more of the maverick style, but maybe I've grown more into that. But definitely, I definitely have a lot more empathy now than I probably did earlier in my career when I was first starting out and taking on small team lead roles and all that. I definitely remember early on when I had a lot less life experience and management experience, treating coworkers and employees more like soldiers, right? Just get the job done, push them, and that's the way it was, and never really build a rapport, build that kind of trust that you need to get with them. I really think that that's something that I really developed through my career before I got to T-Kartor that I think's really helped me as a leader. I realized I had lacked empathy. I just wasn't listening. I think once I actually started actually listening, actually hearing my team, understanding what challenges they might be going through each day and bringing into work each day, building trust doesn't just start with performance or deadlines. It's really, I think it starts with having real conversations and giving a damn about your people. And I think that's really served me well, where that is really a factor of trust that gets built up, and how you can't underestimate the power of just simply listening.
I think that's a lesson that a lot of us learn in the early stages of our career as leaders, perhaps in particular us as young men as we develop over the decades. Can you give a specific example of things you do now in your role to develop that rapport and trust and talking to people? I presume it goes beyond knowing somebody's birthday and that type of stuff. It has to be deeper than that.
Does. And to me, that is one of the things I do now. And I'll tell you, I'm gonna answer this two ways because it really changed when COVID hit, and you lost that presence of being with them all the time. Because like a lot of companies, we went to a almost fully remote schedule, and we're hybrid now, but you still don't have that, what I would call that coffee culture club that actually would happen naturally in the office, where you could easily just talk to people, see how their day's going. In the office back before COVID, it was one of the things I would actually do is around 4 o'clock each day, I would just come out and start having conversations with people at the end of the day. In fact, I remember I had a complaint from an employee because they were upset because they worked early and were gone by 3 o'clock, and they had heard about these constant times I was coming out and actually just for lack of a better term, bullshitting with people and having conversations, and they felt like they were missing out. It just happened to be that's where my schedule fit, and I'd be going through the room, that kind of thing. So that was how I did it before COVID. Now I go about my day of just trying to reach out. Conversations early in the morning are great. While you're having your cup of coffee, just start off the day, checking in with somebody, how they're doing, what's going on with their lives. In fact, I was just talking to my CEO this morning. I know he's irritated because they need to go car shopping, and his wife is complaining that the passenger seat, the one they were driving around, doesn't fit just right. He might be annoyed he's going to go car shopping again this weekend. Little things like that matter, just to know what's going on with them. It takes what, 2 minutes?
Yeah, I think that's really smart to do and crucial. You reference being on a hybrid schedule now, and even during COVID when everybody was fully remote, were you doing these types of casual conversations via Teams or whatever tool you were using?
Trying to. I had several, I would say, attempts and failures at this. I had one idea, I thought it was great, where I was going to do these lunch with the CEO virtual lunches. And I actually had a developer quickly write some code so it would randomly go through employees and pick 4 or 5 to have a weekly lunch with me virtually, where we could have at least a smaller group so people would feel more open to share and talk if you were in a smaller setting. It just didn't work for either my schedule or still not having that one-on-one necessarily because it was still a small group and people still not being totally open. Even in small groups, you have one person that might be more of an extrovert and controls more of the conversation, and you're still not getting to that person that is more maybe an introvert and isn't going to open as much if somebody else is controlling the conversation. And so I found after different attempts like that and failures that it really just needed to be randomly me pinging people when I had a minute. And I just try to think to myself, all right, once a day, did I talk to somebody or a couple people not about work and just check in with them? It's a lot easier with your direct reports. It's a lot harder with those that are down the line that you're maybe not actually knowing exactly what they may be doing day to day. But just checking in on them, it makes a difference. It really does.
I totally agree with you. I'm curious also about this current hybrid schedule. It's a hot topic, of course. Do you find that hybrid is as productive as in the office or as productive as fully remote? What are your whole thoughts around that topic?
Oh, you're right. There's been so much about this, and we've had quite the good and bad challenges with this. I think the first thing I'll say is, right, the ability for companies to fully go remote and how we all pulled it off really proved that it can be done and all the good reasons that you can work from home and everything else. I can tell you, I didn't realize the impact it would have on the culture until about a year after we'd been remote. As much as it helped me get with my team and build rapport and trust, the amount of communication. I remember early days when starting out, and I had one of those grumpy managers that I consider a mentor now that would say, hey, you go to the bathroom to clock out. He's the kind of guy that if you saw people talking by the water cooler, he'd be bitching that they're not working. And I didn't think much about it, but I realized how much of that was building culture and actually, even though 5, 10 minutes of it might have been nothing work accomplished, there might have been 1 minute that was some critical piece of information that people needed to do their job for maybe a tip of something they were run into that day. Or another way to, when the geospatial role, there's 5 different ways you can do the same thing. And each person's got their own little way to do it. And that talk of helping people, of just that casual, oh, try this or whatever, that being lost was so much of an impact that I never saw coming until it was too late. So that is, and if you remember also, it was a big push. If you tried to force people to come out of the office, it was like resignation time. The power definitely went to the employee side of that. And I know it's what big companies are trying to pull back or just, nope, I'll go somewhere else. It seems like that's settled down now, right? We're more in this, I think, more of an even playing field between what I'd call the employee and the company side of how that works. But I think really making sure people communicated on Teams or Zoom or whatever platform you're using. And that goes to your middle managers. One of the big problems I realized is the middle management was taking it for granted. They would send emails and all that, but you got to get with people. You got to check in with them. There's generational differences too between being on the Zoom and all that, and that communication definitely changed. There's been some people that I guess were remote before remote was cool, right? Or they were just remote because of different reasons that they were brought on, maybe as a consultant or a contractor, and they just happened to have a role that was remote before we all went that way. And I found it interesting that those people actually had a lot of good tips for how to stay motivated, how to deal with the differences that are going on because they've been doing it for so long that nobody really thought about until after we were all in the thick of it. One of the things that totally embarrasses me now is when you don't see their faces and then you have, what, a couple of years ago, I learned a very valuable lesson. I've always been great about knowing who my people are and being able to, we're a small company, so I pretty much know everybody by name. We're like, at the height, we were like 77 people. And we actually finally had a get together. It was one of our first ones after things had settled down. You could actually congregate again. And so we had brought people together. And we were at the Grizzlies game, the minor league team across the way, right? Across the river there. And somebody walked up to me, and my wife was standing there, and she threw me under the bus and didn't even realize it. It was actually perfect. And why I was embarrassed and had to throw myself at a sword. Basically, the guy walked up and I'm saying hi to him, not having a clue what his name is, because it totally dropped out of my mind, thinking that a natural introduction would key up his name. And my wife goes, "Are you going to introduce me to him?" And I looked at her and I'm like, I'm up, fall on my sword. And I say, "I apologize. It's been a while. I made my amends and all was good, right? It all worked out." But I remembered, man, that can't happen again. So I've been really cognizant about trying to make sure that I know my staff's names. It makes a difference. If you constantly walk around not remembering people, especially at a small company, it doesn't help you. And I have a kind of a chief of staff now, an admin that really, if I run into problems now, she's there to help. That's a big factor. She might be whispering in my ear, but at least I know who I'm going to be walking up to.
Yeah, that's a tough one, but a good lesson. I do agree with you on the generational difference as it relates to the hybrid work schedule. We run a hybrid schedule. And of course, it seems like the folks earlier in their career are more comfortable or more desirable to have more remote time. But I really try to encourage the folks in that category. You're doing yourself such a disservice by not being around other people at work. You're just not going to learn as fast and as much as you need to if you really want to develop your career.
I will tell you, if I have one thing I would tell anybody out there in their career right now that's working hybrid or remote, and this is a mistake I see. I've even seen my own kids make this mistake. Don't just sit there and do the work and assume. You got to reach out and touch base. Having that connection, even if it's just for 5 minutes with your boss or whatever, don't wait on them. Reach out, ask a question, check in with somebody, even another colleague. I'm sure you've heard of this too with the mental health issues that are starting with people being so segmented away in their lives or in their basement or wherever they're working. And it's creating a real problem. I've seen people that love being able to work from home. There's some people I know that have massive anxiety now when they end up in a social atmosphere way more than they had before. And that's something I think we need to really be cognizant of as we are on this new endeavor in the corporate world, especially as we start bringing things back more like conferences and other get-togethers.
That's really smart advice. Of course, we as leaders probably bear the majority of the responsibility to go talk to the folks that we're in charge of leading. But it is good advice to the folks. Go talk to your leader too, right? Don't be intimidated by a title. Go speak to them. We're all just people. And it's really important for you to show that effort as well. I remember early in my career, I was reporting to a CEO, and almost always when I would show up in his office, I would start the conversation of, how can I help? What can I do to help today? And doing things like that are really important to folks earlier in their career to develop.
It was one of the things you reminded me of when we were talking about this is when I first started actually reaching out to people to really ensure that communication was happening, I actually had to have an all hands kind of meeting, let people know that, hey, don't panic if I call you, because people were started freaking out. Like, why is the CEO reaching out to me? Am I in trouble? Did I do something wrong? Oh no. And some people would really have that massive anxiety attack that something bad was about to happen. And so I really had to then realized as people were giving me this feedback, I got to get people to calm down here, right? Don't panic if I reach out to you. And same like you just said with that open door, I try to encourage people that, hey, I have a virtual open door. If you see my Teams has a little light on, or if you see some way that I'm available, please, if you need something, ping me or check in on chat. Hey, when you have a few minutes, call me. I love to hear from you.
You've given me a lot of really good things to think about, and you may have just answered this, but I'd like to wrap things up with the following question, which would be, if you could provide one guiding leadership principle for people to take away from this conversation, what would it be?
I think there's two things that I really think about. And I mentioned empathy earlier, right? And having a lot of empathy for your staff and your colleagues, I think helps build a lot of trust. But I also think transparency is a big thing for me. Transparency too many times, and I've found this when I've been at the big companies in the corporate world. There was this old mindset of if you give too much information, people will not understand it or they'll misinterpret it. You got to treat everybody like adults. People want to know if the company's having trouble, if it's grim outlooks. It's that transparency and being honest, I think is really clear. And it really helps because I think people respect you more for it. And I think that also helps to building trust. So if I had to really sum it up, I'd say communicate with transparency and lead with empathy.
Simon, I think that's great. One of the things I really enjoy about these conversations is learning from great leaders like yourself. So I really appreciate you sharing your experiences to help educate me and all the folks that are listening to this. So I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Nick. It was a pleasure. I appreciate having me on.
Thank you.